do not live much of an exciting life, but whenever people ask me for a story that still keeps me up at night, this is the one I tell. I was 19 at the time, working a dead-end job at a fish processing plant in a remote coastal town in Nunavut. If you have never been to the far north during winter, it is hard to explain just how isolating it feels. The town swells with seasonal workers during the fishing months, but come November, most of them leave. The bars close down, the shops board up, and it is just the locals, the frozen ocean, and a darkness that stretches on for what feels like forever. Our housing unit sat on a street called Harbor Walk, only a block from the shore. The name made it sound charming, but really it was just a row of stilted prefab boxes connected by a wooden boardwalk-style path that rattled when the wind hit it. I had lived there since I moved up for work, and the routine had become a part of me. I ran almost every night, no matter how cold it got. It was the only way I could clear my head after long shifts gutting fish in fluorescent-lit warehouses that reeked of salt and blood. I was obsessive about staying in shape, even during the off-season. Winters up there are brutal, temperatures that make your lungs ache and your skin crack. So I usually ran late at night when the wind died down and the cold felt less violent. That night, I had slept through most of the day after pulling a double shift, so I had no choice but to go out around midnight if I wanted to keep my routine intact. I never brought my phone with me when I ran. It was always too cold for the battery to last, and even that little bit of extra weight in my pocket would throw off my stride. I know that sounds ridiculous, but I was that particular about it. The only things I carried were my cheap Garmin watch to track distance and pace, and my house keys. My roommate was incredibly uptight about keeping the door locked at all times, even when we were both home. It was one of those non-negotiable rules he drilled into me from day one, and honestly, I still do not understand why he was so paranoid about it. Most people up there did not even lock their doors. It was a small community where everyone knew everyone, but I respected his neurosis, so I stuffed my keys into my shorts pocket every single time I went out, even if it annoyed me. I decided to stick to the elevated boardwalk path that night. The surface was just firm enough to be easy on my knees, and it gave me a long, uninterrupted stretch to zone out. Sometimes I would jog down on the frozen beach for a challenge, but that was not happening after the exhausting shifts I had been pulling. I just wanted a nice, easy long run with no changes in terrain or elevation. The boardwalk would give me exactly that. I started zoning out after the first few kilometers, slipping into that euphoric runner's high where everything else fades away. I always tell people, even today, if you can break that first mental barrier, which happens after about 5 kilometers or so, the rest of the run is easy and borderline meditative. I was listening to the rhythmic slap of my shoes against the frozen wood planks, concentrating on the distant sound of the wind scraping across the ice. I was in that perfect flow state where you forget you are even running, where your body just moves on autopilot and your mind drifts somewhere else entirely. But then I heard it. A faint metallic clink. I stopped dead in my tracks and checked my pocket. Empty. My stomach dropped like a stone. It was my keys. I crouched down immediately, peering through the narrow gaps between the boardwalk planks, but it was useless. It was pitch black underneath, and there was no way I could even see where they had fallen, let alone retrieve them from where I was standing. I started cursing out loud, literally yelling into the empty night. I know that sounds childish, but the adrenaline was still pumping hard from the run, and I was furious that this detour had completely ruined my rhythm. I knew my roommate would have absolutely killed me if I came back without those keys. He had drilled into me how important it was never to lose them, especially because our exact unit number was etched into the metal keychain. It was not just about being locked out. It was about someone potentially knowing exactly which door was ours. Without really thinking it through, I jumped off the side of the boardwalk and landed in the snow below. It was partly a matter of necessity, but also partly pride. I was not just going to walk away from my own belongings. Who does that? The smell under the boardwalk hit me instantly, and it was absolutely vile. It was like rotten seaweed mixed with stale beer and diesel fuel, all layered together in a thick, damp stench that clung to the back of your throat. Imagine filling a bathtub with decomposing kelp and cheap alcohol and then leaving it to ferment for weeks. That is honestly the best way I can describe it. The air was heavy and damp, and every step I took kicked up clumps of frozen sand, scraps of garbage, and things I did not want to identify. I did not have my phone with me, so the weak backlight on my watch was the only thing guiding me, and it was barely doing anything. I crouched down near the spot where I thought my keys had fallen, sweeping my hands through the snow and trash. They were nowhere in sight. Just more garbage, more frozen sand, more stench. I will repeat myself because it bears repeating. It was absolutely disgusting down there. But I needed those keys. I thought about just leaving them and dealing with the consequences. But I had already gotten this far. Turning back now would mean I had gotten covered in filth and stink for absolutely nothing. I tried shifting the snow around, thinking maybe the keys had sunk beneath the surface. But after a few minutes of digging, frustration started to creep in hard. Had I really misjudged the spot by that much? I concluded that had to be the most rational explanation. I'd somehow miscalculated where they had fallen through the gaps. I climbed back up onto the boardwalk, stood exactly where I had stopped running, and tried to figure out a way to mark the precise spot below. That is when I got what I thought was a genius idea. I knelt down, untied one of my shoelaces, and slipped it between the planks, letting it hang down like a little flag. That way, I could crawl back under the boardwalk and spot it easily from below, pinpointing the exact location. As I was standing back up, brushing the ice off my knees, something tugged on the lace, hard. It disappeared into the crack instantly, yanked down into the darkness below, not from the wind, not from me shifting my weight. Something from underneath had pulled it. I could not believe what I had just seen. I was literally frozen in shock, staring at the gap where my shoelace had just been dangling a second earlier. Someone had pulled it. There was someone underneath the boardwalk. My brain immediately started putting two and two together. Whoever was under there probably had my keys too. My first instinct was to run straight home and figure it out later. But then a darker thought crept in. If someone under there had my house keys, they knew exactly where I lived. Our address was etched right into the metal. The idea of some random stranger having that kind of access made my blood boil. I still do not know why I did what I did next. Call it stupid teenage confidence, or just pure adrenaline-fueled recklessness. But I took a deep breath, jumped back down into the snow, and crawled under the boardwalk again. It felt completely different the second time. The air felt heavier, thicker, like it was pressing down on my chest. I was bracing myself for some kind of confrontation, maybe even a fight. At one point, I heard faint shuffling somewhere ahead of me in the darkness. My chest tightened painfully. I swung my watch light toward the sound, but I saw nothing. Just more frozen sand, more wooden support beams, more shadows. I kept moving forward slowly, and then I heard the shuffling again. But this time it came from a completely different direction. That is when I realized the horrifying truth. The noise was not coming from just one spot. There were multiple people under there. That realization hit me like a freight train. Common sense finally struck me square in the face. What in the world could I have possibly expected to happen? Was I just going to fight some crackhead living under the boardwalk in the dark? That was suicide. Pure stupidity. I turned immediately to get out of there, trying not to let panic fully take over. But before I could make it all the way to the edge, something ice cold latched onto my ankle. It was a hand. I screamed in pain as fingernails dug deep into my skin, tearing through the fabric of my running tights. I did not think. I just reacted. I kicked as hard as I possibly could, and my foot connected with something solid. I felt bone or cartilage crunch under the impact. Whoever was holding on to my ankle let go immediately. I scrambled away on my hands and knees, scraping my legs and arms against the sand and splintered wood as I clawed my way out into the open air. I did not stop moving. I did not look back. I sprinted straight home, faster than I had ever run in my entire life. When I reached our front door, I pounded on it until my roommate finally opened up. To say he was furious would be a massive understatement. He was absolutely livid. I was surprised he did not physically throw me out right there. But before he could fully lose it on me, I explained everything in a breathless rush. The keys, the shoelace, the people hiding under the boardwalk, the hand grabbing my ankle. The commotion woke up our neighbor who came over, angry at first. But when she saw the deep scratches and blood on my ankle, her expression shifted to something closer to genuine fear. My roommate did not waste any time. He called the local RCMP detachment, and the next morning, we had a locksmith come out to change all the locks on our unit. For a couple of days afterwards, things felt relatively normal again. I figured that was the end of it. Just a weird, messed up night that I would eventually try to forget. But then, a few mornings later, I woke up to loud, insistent knocking at the front door. It was early, way too early for visitors or deliveries. I sat in bed for a while, waiting for my roommate to deal with it. But when he did not move, I decided to handle it myself. I pulled on a hoodie and went to the door. I looked through the peephole, but there was no one there. Confused, I opened the door and looked around. There was no one in sight on the street. No cars, no people, nothing. Right when I was about to close the door and go back to bed, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. Sitting on the frozen doormat, meticulously cleaned and gleaming in the early light, was my shoelace. The one from that night. I slammed the door shut without another thought. We got a security system installed that very afternoon. For weeks afterwards, my roommate and I lived in constant low-level fear, jumping at every creak and shadow. But nothing ever happened after that. When I think back to this experience, I still cannot rationalize the events that took place. Even though I do not live in that unit anymore, it still creeps me out knowing that some random stranger not only has my keys, but took the time and effort to return my shoelace in the most unsettling way possible. They wanted me to know they had been there. They wanted me to know they could find me. The thing about driving the winter road late at night is that it used to be one of the most peaceful parts of my job. I worked as a supply courier for a logistics company that serviced remote communities across northern Manitoba, and the long stretches of isolated highway between towns became almost meditative after a while. There was something calming about the emptiness, the way the headlights carved through total darkness, the occasional flicker of northern lights dancing across the sky like green ghosts. No traffic, no lights, no houses for hundreds of kilometers. Just frozen forest, endless snow, and the hum of the engine. If you have never driven a winter road during the deep freeze of February, it is hard to explain just how alone you feel out there. It is the kind of solitude that makes you feel like the last person on Earth. And for the longest time, I actually enjoyed that feeling. I was 26 when this happened, and I had been running that route for almost 3 years without incident. I knew every turn, every landmark, every place where the ice groaned loudest on the lakes we crossed. That particular night, I was making a return trip from a small reserve back to my home base in Thompson. The load was light, just empty crates and paperwork, so I was making good time. The temperature had dropped to nearly -40, cold enough that you could feel it seeping through the truck's heating system no matter how high you cranked it. I had my thermos of coffee, my playlist on low, and I was settled into that familiar rhythm of long-distance driving, where your body is on autopilot but your mind wanders somewhere else entirely. About halfway through the drive, I started to feel something strange. It was not anything I could put my finger on at first, just this creeping sensation that I was being watched. I shook it off, telling myself it was just fatigue, or the isolation playing tricks on my mind. But then I glanced in the rearview mirror, more out of habit than anything else, and I saw something that made my stomach drop. There was a figure standing on the road far behind me, illuminated by the red glow of my taillights. A person, alone, standing completely still in the middle of the winter road. I blinked hard, thinking maybe it was a trick of the light, or a road sign I had forgotten about. But no, it was definitely a person. A lone figure, motionless, facing in my direction. I tried to rationalize it immediately. Maybe it was someone from one of the communities out for a walk, or dealing with a broken-down vehicle I had not noticed. But even as I thought it, I knew how absurd that was. Nobody would be out here on foot in these temperatures, not unless something had gone catastrophically wrong. And if that were the case, they would be waving me down, calling for help, not just standing there like a statue. I kept driving, but I could not stop myself from checking the mirror again a few minutes later. My heart started pounding before my brain could even process what I was seeing. The same figure was still visible, but now they were much closer, still perfectly still facing my direction. I pressed down harder on the gas pedal, telling myself it was impossible, that I was imagining things. There was no way someone could cover that much distance on foot in just a few minutes, not in waist-deep snow and sub-zero temperatures. But curiosity mixed with rising panic made me keep checking the mirror, and every single time I looked, he was closer, always motionless when I looked, always facing me, never running, never walking, just somehow appearing nearer with each glance. The road felt endless, stretching out into a black void that swallowed my headlights. I started to hear things too, faint crunching sounds like footsteps on hard-packed snow, but only when I eased off the gas. The heater fan and my own increasingly heavy breathing drowned out most ambient noise, and I could not tell if the sounds were real or if my mind was creating them to match the growing terror I felt. I was gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles ached, and I kept looking between the road ahead and the rearview mirror, back and forth, back and forth. Each time I checked, he was closer. 10 meters behind, then 5. Then close enough that I should have been able to make out features, but his face was hidden beneath a dark hood, and the red taillights only caught the outline of his shape. My chest was so tight I could barely breathe. The rational part of my brain kept screaming that this was not possible, that no human being could keep pace with a truck going 80 kilometers an hour. But my eyes were telling me something completely different. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, I saw the distant glow of lights marking the edge of town. Relief flooded through me so powerfully I almost started crying. I was shaking, exhausted from the adrenaline, and I just wanted to get home, lock my door, and convince myself this had all been some kind of stress-induced hallucination. I turned into a small, empty parking lot near my apartment building, my hands still trembling on the wheel. I put the truck in park and just sat there for a moment, trying to catch my breath and slow my racing heart. I looked in the rearview mirror one last time, almost compulsively, expecting to see nothing but empty pavement. But when I looked up, my blood turned to ice. The man was standing at the far end of the parking lot, exactly where my truck had just pulled out from seconds before. He was just standing there, his hood still obscuring most of his face, illuminated now by the flickering orange glow of a nearby streetlight. I could not see his eyes, but I knew he was looking directly at me. I could feel it. I nearly stalled the truck, trying to throw it into reverse. My foot slipped off the clutch and the engine lurched violently, but I did not care. The headlights swung across the lot as I cranked the wheel, and for just a split second they caught the lower half of his face. His skin was pale, almost gray in the harsh light, and his expression was completely blank. No anger, no malice, just nothing. I fishtailed out of the parking lot, tires spinning on the ice, and I did not stop until I was parked directly in front of my building's main entrance under the brightest light I could find. I sprinted from the truck to the door, fumbling with my keys so badly I almost dropped them. And I did not feel safe until I had slammed my apartment door shut and locked every single lock. I spent the rest of that night peeking through the blinds at the parking lot below, convinced I was going to see him standing under one of the lights, staring up at my window. Every shadow looked like him. Every movement of the trees in the wind made my heart race. I did not sleep at all that night. When the sun finally came up, I felt more exhausted than I had after any shift I had ever worked. I called in sick for the next 3 days, something I had never done before. I told my supervisor I had the flu, but really I just could not bring myself to get back in that truck. The thought of driving that route again, of seeing him in the rearview mirror, made me physically ill. In the following weeks, I had recurring nightmares about him. In every single one, he was standing at the end of some long space. A hallway, a parking lot, a road, a frozen lake. Always motionless, always facing me, and always a little bit closer every time I looked. In some of the dreams, I would turn away and then turn back, and he would be right behind me, close enough to touch, but I would wake up before I ever saw his full face. My mind kept trying to fill in the blank, making him worse than anything real could possibly be. I started having panic attacks whenever I had to drive at night, even short distances in well-lit areas. My hands would shake, my breathing would get shallow, and I would have to pull over until it passed. Eventually, I begged my supervisor to reassign me to day routes only, and when he pushed back, I told him I would quit if he did not accommodate me. He must have heard something in my voice that convinced him I was serious, because he agreed without any more questions. I have not driven a winter road at night since then, and I never will again. My friends and family think I am being irrational, that I am letting one weird experience control my life, but they were not there. They did not see him. They did not watch him get closer and closer in the mirror, while their brains screamed that it was impossible. What haunts me most is that I never truly saw his face. I only caught that brief glimpse of his lower jaw and mouth, pale and expressionless, and maybe that is what makes it so much worse. My imagination has filled in the rest, creating 100 different versions of what he might have looked like, and every single one of them is more terrifying than the last. Sometimes I wonder if he was even real, or if I experienced some kind of psychological break from the isolation and exhaustion. But then, I remember the way the streetlight caught him in that parking lot. Solid and real and impossible to deny. He was there. And wherever he is now, I hope I never see him again. I spent most of my early 20s bouncing between work camps in northern Alberta, taking whatever contract jobs I could find to save up money for school. The camps were exactly what you would expect: depressing, isolated, and filled with people who were only there because the pay was decent enough to ignore how miserable the conditions were. Most of the workers kept to themselves, showed up for their shifts, and counted down the days until they could leave. It was not the kind of place where you made friends or felt particularly safe, but it was not dangerous either. At least, that is what I kept telling myself. The camp I was stationed at that winter was about 3 hours north of Fort McMurray, accessible only by a single logging road that turned into a nightmare of ice and mud depending on the season. The accommodations were modular units stacked in rows like shipping containers, each one housing 4 workers in cramped bunk-style rooms. The whole setup felt temporary and cheap, like it could be packed up and moved at any moment, which I suppose was the point. The worst part about the camp was not the work itself, but the layout. Whoever designed it clearly did not think about convenience or comfort. The washroom facilities were detached from the main sleeping quarters, sitting at the far edge of the camp in a standalone cinder-block building that always smelled like industrial cleaner and something sour underneath. During the day, it was annoying to walk over there, but at night it felt like a trek across no man's land. The pathway between the units and the washroom was poorly lit, with only a few flickering overhead lights that barely cut through the darkness. Most guys just pissed outside rather than make the walk, but I was never comfortable doing that. My friends used to make fun of me for it, calling me uptight, but I just could not bring myself to do it. So every night, if I needed to go, I made the walk. That particular night, I had been drinking with a few of the other workers in one of the common rooms. Nothing crazy, just a few beers to take the edge off after a long shift. By the time I headed back to my unit, it was past midnight and the camp was quiet. Most people were either asleep or keeping to themselves. I lay in my bunk for a while, scrolling through my phone, even though the signal was terrible, but eventually I realized I needed to use the washroom. I debated holding it until morning, but I knew I would not be able to sleep, so I pulled on a hoodie and slipped outside. The air was brutally cold, the kind that stings your lungs with every breath, and the sky was so clear you could see every single star. I walked quickly, hands shoved deep in my pockets, appreciating the silence and the northern lights flickering faintly on the horizon. The washroom door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, and I immediately regretted coming. The place smelled awful, like bleach trying and failing to cover up something. Much worse, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in a harsh, sickly glow that made the cracked tiles and stained sinks look even more depressing. I figured I would make it quick, so I headed to the farthest stall and locked myself in. The walls were covered in crude graffiti, phone numbers, and half-finished insults carved into the paint. I was reading some of the more absurd messages when I heard the door creak open again. I winced, annoyed that I would no longer have privacy, and I listened as footsteps slowly entered the washroom. But the footsteps did not head toward the urinals or the sinks. They just circled the room, slowly, deliberately, like someone was pacing. At first, I thought maybe it was just another drunk worker wandering around aimlessly, but something about the rhythm felt off. The steps would move in one direction, pause, then move in another, almost like whoever it was inspecting the space. At times, it sounded like the footsteps were coming from multiple directions, like there was more than one person, but I could not be sure. The acoustics in that concrete box made everything echo strangely. Eventually, the footsteps stopped near the sinks. Complete silence. No movement, no coughing, no rustling of clothes. The water did not turn on. I had no idea what they were doing, and the silence was somehow worse than the pacing. I finished up, ready to get out of there as quickly as possible, but when I went to push the stall door open, it would not budge. I jiggled the latch, thinking maybe it had stuck, but the door was completely jammed. I pushed harder, then put my shoulder into it, but it felt like someone was holding it shut from the outside. Frustration and discomfort flooded through me. I wanted to punch the door, to yell, but something stopped me. The footsteps started again, and this time they were much closer. I could hear them right outside my stall, slow and deliberate. I felt this really sick, crawling sensation in my chest, like someone was standing inches away on the other side of that flimsy metal door. I tried shoving the door again with all my weight, but it still would not move. The adrenaline was starting to kick in hard now, and my brain was connecting dots I did not want to connect. Someone was holding the door shut. Someone was trapping me in here. I was not just going to sit there like some helpless victim waiting for whatever was going to happen next. I backed up as far as the tiny stall would allow, then charged the door with everything I had. It finally gave way, the latch snapping open, and I stumbled out into the main washroom area. As I burst out, I caught a glimpse of the main bathroom door swinging shut, like someone had just slipped out at the exact moment I broke free. I scanned the washroom quickly, my heart hammering in my chest. It was empty. Whoever had been walking around in there, whoever had been holding my stall door shut, was gone. But that did not make sense. I had heard the footsteps stop right outside my stall just seconds before. There was no way someone could have crossed the entire washroom and made it out the door that fast without me hearing them run. Unless they had been standing there the whole time, waiting, and bolted the moment I forced the door open. I did not waste time thinking about it. I went to the sink and hastily washed my hands, keeping my eyes on the reflection in the grimy mirror, watching the stalls behind me. Everything looked still, but I could not shake the feeling that I was not alone. I dried my hands on my jeans and headed straight for the exit. I grabbed the door handle and turned it, but it would not move. The handle would not even rotate, as if the door had somehow been locked from the outside. I froze, my mind racing. This had to be some kind of prank. Maybe one of the guys from my unit was messing with me, trying to scare me because they knew I got uncomfortable easily. But that did not make sense either. None of them had seen me leave. They were all back in the common room when I left. And this was not really the kind of thing any of them would do. This felt different. This felt wrong. I gritted my teeth and started banging on the door, yelling for whoever was outside to open up. My voice echoed off the concrete walls, sounding desperate and small. I got no response, just silence. Then behind me, I heard movement in one of the stalls. The soft creak of a door hinge, the faint scrape of a shoe against tile. I whipped my head around, staring at the row of stalls. All the doors appeared closed, and I did not see any feet beneath any of them. That meant whoever was in there was standing on one of the toilets, deliberately hiding, trying to stay out of sight. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. There had been 2 people in here the whole time. One had left to lock the door from the outside, and the other had stayed behind, waiting in one of the stalls like some kind of trap. I thought about yelling again, about demanding they show themselves, but what would that accomplish? If they wanted to hurt me, they had already had plenty of opportunities. This was deliberate. This was planned. I looked around frantically for another way out and noticed a small, grimy window up near the ceiling above the sinks. It was not big, but it might be enough. I did not have another option. I climbed onto the sink, which groaned and shifted under my weight, and I genuinely thought it was going to rip off the wall and send me crashing to the floor. But it held. I shoved the window open, the hinges protesting loudly, and started pulling myself up. I was halfway through, my legs still dangling inside, when one of the stall doors behind me suddenly burst open with a loud bang. I locked eyes with a man for just a split second. He was standing in the doorway of the stall, and the image burned into my brain instantly. He was incredibly hairy, with wild, unkempt hair and a thick beard, and his skin was so pale it almost looked gray under the fluorescent lights. But what disturbed me most was his clothes. He was dressed like a teenager, wearing a faded band shirt and ripped jeans, but this man had to be at least 50 years old. His expression was completely blank, not angry or threatening, just empty. I did not waste another second. I scrambled the rest of the way through the window and dropped down hard onto the frozen ground outside. My knee slammed into the ice and pain shot up my leg, but I did not care. I just ran. I sprinted back toward the main camp, limping slightly, not daring to look back until I was inside one of the lit buildings. I called the camp security office from a supervisor's desk, and they showed up within minutes. When they checked the washroom, it was empty. The door was unlocked, the window still open, but the man was long gone. That part of the camp was completely dead at night. No shops, no other buildings, and definitely no security cameras. There was no way to prove what had happened. No way to identify who he was or where he had gone. The security officer walked me through everything, taking notes, and pointed out fresh scratches around the outside door handle. He said it looked like someone had tampered with the lock mechanism, jamming it from the outside so it would not open from the inside. He told me I was smart to go through the window, that waiting around could have ended very badly. But that was it. No investigation, no follow-up, nothing. I left the camp 2 days later, breaking my contract early and forfeiting the rest of my pay. I did not care. I have never gone back to a work camp since, and I never will. I'm sorry in advance if I mess up some of the details of this story, but it happened when I was really young. I do not remember exactly how old I was at the time, maybe 8 or 9, but I know it was during one of those summers my family spent at my grandparents' place, near a small lakeshore community in northern Ontario. It was kind of like the family hub every summer. A bunch of us would pile in for weekends or entire weeks at a time. My siblings, my cousins, my aunts and uncles, sometimes even family friends. The house was not anything fancy or modern, but it had enough bedrooms to sleep our whole extended family, and it was really close to the lake. I used to spend entire days playing in the sand, riding my bike around the neighborhood, exploring the woods with my cousins. Every summer I spent there felt amazing. It still feels like an extended fever dream, especially now as I am getting further and further removed from that blissful childhood. I remember that particular summer being different though. There was some big flooding forecasted, one that had the whole community scrambling to take precautions months in advance. The town decided to build these massive sand barriers along the shore as a makeshift flood wall. I am not sure if calling them barriers is exactly accurate. They were huge. I mean, to a kid they looked like castle walls or mountain ranges. I bet the aerial view of the shoreline during that time would have looked absolutely insane. That summer, my siblings and I spent hours climbing those sand walls, tumbling down the other side, pretending we were scaling fortress walls or sneaking into enemy territory. It was the best playground we could have asked for. But it was also really weird. Usually, when you are standing on the boardwalk facing the lake, you can see the water stretching out in front of you, endless and calming, but those sand walls completely block the view. You would walk along the boardwalk, and instead of water, there was just this giant wall of sand towering over everything. It felt wrong, somehow, like the town had been cut off from the lake entirely. The lakefront also closed after a certain hour. The lifeguards would go off duty, and people were not technically permitted to go down to the sand, but that rule never really stopped us locals. The town was safe, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and letting kids roam around was not considered a big deal, especially after the tourist crowds thinned out in the evening. As long as we promised not to go in the water, our parents did not really mind. And to be honest, I was kind of a little troublemaker back then. I liked pushing boundaries, especially when I thought I could get away with it. That is what led me to sneak out that evening. It was not even dark yet. The sun had not started setting, but I had not asked permission to go outside. I just wanted some alone time. I think I had gotten into a fight with one of my brothers earlier, but I do not really remember the details. The sliding door downstairs, where all the kids' bedrooms were located, made it really easy to come and go unnoticed. My older cousins had practically written the playbook on sneaking in and out, usually for way more rebellious reasons than a solo walk. But I had learned from watching them. Even today, we still laugh about how easy it was to slip out of that house without alerting the adults. I stepped outside as quietly as I could, not even bothering to put shoes on, and made my way toward the boardwalk. I was expecting to see some locals, maybe even some kids my age playing near the sand. Even after the lakefront officially closed, there were usually people around, especially anyone who lived nearby or was staying in one of the rental houses. I was kind of surprised to see how completely empty it was. Not a single person outside. No families packing up their beach gear, no joggers, no dog walkers, nothing. It felt deserted in a way I had never experienced before. I am talking not a single soul in sight. It was strange and a little bit unsettling, like the whole town had just vanished. I walked along the boardwalk for a little while, half expecting to run into someone eventually, but I never did. It felt like the whole lakefront was asleep or abandoned. I was about to head back to the house when I noticed something alarming in the distance. There was a thin trail of smoke rising from behind one of the sand walls. At first, I thought maybe it was just fog rolling in off the lake, but I looked closer and confirmed that it was definitely smoke, like smoke from a fire, the kind that comes from burning wood or garbage. Smoke on the shore was not that unusual, even though it was technically against the rules and borderline illegal. Sometimes tourists would light small fires in the evening despite the posted signs. But there was something about how empty everything was that night that made the smoke feel deeply wrong. It kind of looked like a tiny volcano, the way the smoke just rose straight up from the sand wall like it was coming out of the ground itself. I looked around for an adult, someone I could tell, or someone who could check it out, but there was no one. Just the empty boardwalk stretching out in both directions, silent except for the wind. I should have gone straight home. I know that now. But curiosity got the better of me, and honestly, my parents had always taught me never to turn my back on someone who might be in need. This situation felt like that. What if someone had started a fire and then gotten hurt? What if they needed help? I climbed the sand wall a little ways away from where the smoke was rising. By the time I reached the top, I was covered in sand, my hands and knees scraped from grabbing onto the loose, shifting surface. I looked down the other side and saw exactly what I expected to see, a bonfire. But the weird thing was that it was completely isolated. There was no one around. No chairs, no coolers, no towels, no footprints in the sand leading away. Just a fire burning in the middle of the empty shore, as if whoever had started it had simply abandoned it and disappeared. It did not sit right with me. Even at that age, I knew leaving a fire unattended like that was dangerous. Fires could spread, especially with the dry conditions we had been having that summer. I slid down the sand wall on the lakeside and made my way over to the fire. I stood there for a second, just staring at it, trying to figure out what to do. I did not have water or anything to put it out with, so I just started kicking sand onto it. I did that over and over, scooping sand with my feet and hands, until the flames were finally smothered and only smoke remained. I did not want to leave just yet. I was way too curious. I could not think of any logical reason why someone would light a fire in a restricted area just to abandon it completely, unless they were trying to hide something or commit some kind of crime. I inspected the fire pit more closely, and that is when I made some truly disturbing discoveries. There were clothes in the ashes, little kids' clothes, stuff that I would wear, small jackets, tiny shoes, socks, pieces of fabric that had been half buried and burned. My stomach dropped. I bent down, using a stick to poke through the remains, and I realized that the fire had mostly been used to burn clothing. But then I found something even worse: photos. Or at least what was left of them. Most were charred beyond recognition, curled and blackened, but one had survived enough for me to make out a face. It was a boy, probably around my age, maybe a little younger. He had light hair and a shy smile, and he honestly looked a little bit like me. Like, if one of my parents had told me he was a distant cousin or a neighbor kid, I would have believed them without question. The picture made me feel really sick inside, like something terrible had happened, and I had just stumbled onto the evidence. I felt myself wanting to run. My hands were shaking, and I dropped the stick. I was just a little kid. I had obviously never been through anything that scary or disturbing before, so I was completely freaking out. But it got so much worse. I heard a voice shout out from somewhere down the shore. A man's voice, harsh and loud, yelling, "Hey!" I looked up and saw a man coming toward me from further down the beach. He was bald, and I could not make out much of his face from that distance, but I could see that he was staggering with every few steps, like he was fighting not to trip over his own feet. It looked like he was drunk, or maybe on something worse. He yelled again, "Hey, kid," and started moving more quickly toward me, his gait uneven and jerky. I could not move. I was completely frozen to the spot, paralyzed by fear. My brain could not process what was happening fast enough. He yelled again, "Don't you go anywhere!" And that was what finally snapped me out of it. My survival instinct kicked in, and I started running toward the sand wall as fast as my legs would carry me. The sand made running incredibly hard, like trying to sprint through thick mud, but I felt like I was in a life and death situation. I started climbing the wall, clawing at the sand with my hands, my feet slipping and sliding. I could hear him yelling obscene things behind me, his voice getting closer and louder. He was gaining on me. Just as I reached the top of the sand wall, I felt fingernails clawing at my ankle, scratching and grabbing. By some miracle, he was never able to get a solid grip on me. I vaulted myself over the top of the wall and tumbled down the other side, landing hard on the boardwalk side. I did not stop. I sprinted all the way home, looking back over my shoulder a few times to make sure he was not following me. He was not, but I kept running like my life depended on it. When I got back to the house, I immediately went to my bedroom and started crying. I wanted to tell my parents. I really did. But all I could think about was how much trouble I would be in for sneaking out. I was terrified they would ground me for the rest of the summer, or worse, and I convinced myself that staying silent was the safer option. So I kept my mouth shut. Looking back, I know I should have said something. I should have told my parents, or any adult, what I had seen. But I did not, and nothing ever came of it as far as I know. There were no news reports, no police presence at the lakefront the next day, no missing children reported in the area. I still do not know what to make of this, even though it happened such a long time ago. I cannot help but feel like there is more to the story, something I will never understand. What terrifies me the most is how eerily similar that kid in the photo looked to me. Sometimes I wish I could go back in time and tell my younger self to speak up, to tell someone what I saw, but I cannot. All I can do is carry that memory with me and hope that whoever that boy was, he is okay. I spent 2 years working as a mechanic at a remote mining operation in northern Quebec, and those were some of the strangest, most isolating years of my life. The camp was located about 400 kilometers from the nearest proper town, accessible only by a single logging road that turned into an absolute nightmare during winter. Communication with the outside world was spotty at best. We had satellite internet that worked maybe half the time, and cell service was completely non-existent. News traveled slowly up there, filtered through whatever fragments we could pick up on the radio, or through emails that took hours to send. Because of that isolation, rumors became our main source of entertainment. People would start wild stories about things happening in other camps, about workers going missing, about strange lights in the forest, and within days, those stories would spread through the entire operation like wildfire. Most of it was nonsense, just bored men trying to make life more interesting, but every now and then, you would hear something that made you wonder if maybe there was some truth buried in the exaggeration. I was 24 at the time, and I had taken the job specifically because it paid well, and I needed to save money quickly. The work was brutal, long shifts in freezing conditions, but the money was good enough that I could ignore how miserable everything else was. The camp itself was a collection of modular buildings and trailers arranged in a rough grid, connected by gravel paths that turned to ice for most of the year. There were maybe 60 of us living there at any given time, a mix of mechanics, engineers, equipment operators, and supervisors. Everyone kept to themselves for the most part. You would see the same faces in the dining hall or the common room, exchange a few words, and then go back to your routines. It was not the kind of place where you made close friends. People were too tired, too focused on getting through their contracts and getting out. That particular night, it was storming hard. The wind was howling so loud, you could hear it even inside the buildings, and the snow was coming down in thick, blinding sheets. A few of us were sitting in the common room after our shifts, half watching a movie on a laptop, when someone turned on the radio to check the weather forecast. The reception was terrible, full of static and cutting in and out, but we managed to catch fragments of an RCMP broadcast. It was hard to make out the details, but we heard enough to piece together that they were looking for someone, a dangerous escapee, possibly heading north. The dispatcher mentioned something about a violent offender who had fled custody somewhere south of us, and there was concern he might be trying to disappear into the remote areas where tracking him would be nearly impossible. One of the supervisors laughed it off immediately, saying there was no way anyone would come all the way up here. He pointed out that we were hundreds of kilometers from anywhere, that the roads were barely passable, and that even if someone did make it this far, they would freeze to death within hours if they did not have shelter. Most of us agreed. It seemed absurd to think that some fugitive would risk his life trying to reach a place as isolated as our camp. We dismissed it as irrelevant and went back to whatever we were doing. but I could not shake the uneasy feeling that settled in my stomach. Something about the whole situation felt off, even if I could not put my finger on why. Later that night, the power started flickering. It happened occasionally during storms, so nobody panicked, but it was annoying. The lights would dim, the heating systems would stutter, and then everything would come back online a few seconds later. What we did not realize until the next morning was that the flickering had knocked out some of our exterior cameras and several of the floodlights that illuminated the pathways between buildings. The camp security was minimal to begin with, just a couple of cameras and motion sensor lights, so losing even a few of them made everything feel more vulnerable. Around 11 that night, I realized I had left some tools in one of the equipment sheds across the camp. I needed them for an early morning job, and I did not want to deal with the hassle of retrieving them in the dark at 5 in the morning, so I volunteered to make the walk and grab them. It was only a few minutes away, and I figured it would be quick and painless. I bundled up in my parka and headed out into the storm. The wind hit me like a wall the moment I stepped outside, and the cold cut through my clothes almost immediately, despite all the layers I was wearing. The snow was coming down so thick, I could barely see more than a few meters ahead. I kept my head down and followed the gravel path by memory, using the dim glow of the few working lights to guide me. As I passed one of the disused storage sheds near the edge of camp, I noticed something strange. There were fresh boot prints in the snow leading directly toward the shed. Deep, clear prints that had not been filled in by the storm yet, which meant they were recent. That shed had not been opened in weeks, maybe months. There was no reason for anyone to be over there, especially not in the middle of a storm. I stopped and stared at the prints for a moment, debating whether I should just ignore them and keep walking. But curiosity got the better of me. I followed the prints to the shed door and noticed it was slightly ajar, hanging open just a crack. I pushed it open slowly, and the hinges creaked loudly in protest. Inside, it was pitch black except for the faint glow of my headlamp. I called out, asking if anyone was in there, but I got no response. Just as I was about to leave, I heard it. Breathing. Slow, deliberate breathing, and the faint creak of shifting boards, like someone was moving carefully to stay. Hidden. My heart started pounding. I backed out of the shed immediately, not bothering to close the door, and walked as quickly as I could toward the main camp without breaking into a run. I did not want to panic, but I also did not want to stick around and find out who or what was in there. When I got back to my quarters, I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe it was just one of the other workers using the shed for something. Or maybe I had imagined the breathing entirely. But I could not shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I locked my door, which I almost never did, and tried to go to sleep, but sleep would not come. I kept replaying the sound of that breathing in my head, the way the boards had creaked, like someone was deliberately trying to stay quiet. A few hours later, I woke up to a noise. My door was slightly ajar, even though I was absolutely certain I had locked it before going to bed. My stomach dropped. I sat up slowly, my heart racing, and scanned the room. Everything looked normal at first glance, but then I noticed my bag. It was sitting on the floor near the foot of my bed, and it had been rifled through. The contents were slightly scattered, zippers opened, pockets turned inside out. I immediately checked for my wallet and my camp ID pass. Both were missing. My hands started shaking as I realized what that meant. Someone had been in my room while I was sleeping. Someone had gone through my things and taken my identification. I got dressed as quickly as I could and went straight to the security office. The supervisor on duty looked annoyed at first, like I was overreacting. But when I explained about the shed, the footprints, and my missing ID, his expression changed. He radioed the other supervisors, and within 20 minutes, the entire camp was on lockdown. Nobody was allowed to leave their quarters, and a team was organized to sweep the camp and check every building. We waited for hours, sitting in the common room with a dozen other workers, all of us tense and confused. Eventually, the security team reported back. They had found my ID and camp pass discarded near the back fence, partially buried in the snow. Next to them were boot prints leading off into the forest, disappearing into the tree line. The camp stayed on lockdown for the rest of the night while we waited for the RCMP to arrive. But because of the storm and the condition of the road, it took them almost 2 full days to reach us. By the time they showed up, the prints had been covered by fresh snow, and there was no way to track where they led. They searched the surrounding area as best they could, but it was like looking for a ghost. A few days after that, we finally got news from the outside. A violent offender had been captured over 300 kilometers away, near a different mining camp. He had a stolen camp jacket stuffed in his bag, along with several IDs and passes from workers at various operations. The RCMP confirmed that he had been moving between remote camps, breaking in, stealing supplies and identification, and disappearing before anyone could catch him. They could not definitively prove he had been at our camp, but the evidence was hard to ignore. What haunts me the most is not the idea that some dangerous fugitive was wandering around our camp in the middle of the night. What haunts me is knowing that he was in my room while I was there. He stood over me while I slept, went through my belongings, took my ID, and left without waking me. I keep thinking about how close I was to waking up and catching him in the act, and what might have happened if I had. Would he have run? Would he have attacked me? I will never know, and maybe that is for the best. But the thought of it, the idea that someone was standing in the darkness just a few feet away from me, breathing quietly, and going through my things is something I cannot shake. I left that job a few months later. I told everyone it was because I found better work closer to home, but really, I just could not stay there anymore. Every night, I would lie in bed and wonder if my door was really locked, if someone was standing outside listening, waiting for me to fall asleep. I have never gone back to remote work since, and I do not think I ever will. Living in a small northern town in Yukon means relying heavily on the internet and social media, especially during the long winter months when darkness dominates most of the day. I moved up there for work when I was 25, taking a government contract that paid well but required me to spend at least 2 years in one of the most isolated communities I had ever seen. The town had maybe 300 permanent residents, a handful of essential services, and not much else. The winters were brutal, not just because of the cold, but because of the isolation. The sun would set around 3 in the afternoon and would not rise again until almost noon the next day. That kind of darkness does something to you. It makes you feel disconnected from the rest of the world, like you are living in a bubble where time moves differently and nothing outside really matters anymore. To combat that crushing sense of isolation, I relied on video calls and messaging apps to stay connected with friends and family back south. It became a nightly ritual for me. I would make myself dinner, settle onto my couch with my laptop, and spend a few hours talking to people I missed. People who reminded me that there was a world beyond the frozen darkness outside my window. The internet up there was terrible, though. We had satellite service that would cut out randomly, especially during storms or heavy cloud cover. Sometimes, it would take hours to load a single web page, and video calls were a gamble. You never knew if the connection would hold or if you would spend the entire conversation frozen on a buffering screen. Cell service was completely non-existent unless you drove almost an hour south to the nearest highway. So messaging apps and email were our only real options for communication. Most people in town had learned to live with it, to accept that staying connected required patience and a lot of frustration. I had gotten used to it too, or at least I thought I had. That night, though, everything changed. It was late February, and we were in the middle of a nasty winter storm. The wind was howling, rattling the windows of my small apartment, and the power had been dipping on and off all evening. I was bored and restless, scrolling through social media on my phone when I got a video call notification from my younger cousin, Emily, who lived in Toronto. I was surprised because she rarely called me, usually preferring to text, but I answered it anyway. I was happy for the distraction. The call connected, but the video was glitchy from the start. Her face kept freezing, the audio cutting in and out, and there was a noticeable delay between when she spoke and when I heard her words. I almost hung up and suggested we try again later, but she seemed insistent on talking, so I stuck with it. Right away, something felt off about the conversation. Emily was usually bubbly and talkative, always going on about her job or her friends or whatever drama was happening in her life, but that night she was quiet, almost subdued. She kept asking me strange, weirdly specific questions about my apartment. She asked which floor I was on, which side of the building my windows faced, whether my bedroom door locked from the inside. At first, I thought maybe she was just making conversation or asking out of curiosity, but the questions kept getting more detailed. She asked if my balcony door had a deadbolt, if I kept my curtains open at night, if anyone else lived on my floor. I started to feel uncomfortable, but I tried to brush it off. I told myself she was probably just worried about me living alone in such a remote place, that maybe she had seen some news story about break-ins and was concerned for my safety. But then she mentioned something that made my stomach turn. She casually asked if I had rearranged my furniture recently, specifically mentioning that my couch now faced the window instead of the TV. I had moved my couch a few weeks earlier, but I'd never told anyone about it. I had never posted photos of my apartment online, never mentioned it in a text or email. There was no way she could have known that unless she had somehow seen inside my apartment. I felt a cold prickle of fear run down my spine, but I tried to stay calm. I asked her how she knew about the couch, and she just laughed it off, saying she must have remembered it from a video call we had done months ago. But that did not make sense. We had not video called in over 6 months, and my furniture had been arranged completely differently back then. The call kept glitching, freezing on frames that felt wrong somehow. At one point, the video froze on an image of Emily staring directly at the camera, her eyes locked on something behind me, her expression blank and unreadable. I turned around to look, but there was nothing there, just my empty apartment, my dark windows reflecting the glow of my laptop screen. When the call unfroze, she was talking again, asking me to go check a noise near my back door. She said she thought she heard something, that I should go look while staying on the call. She kept insisting, saying it was probably nothing but that I should check just to be safe. Her tone was strange, almost urgent, and it made me deeply uneasy. I told her I had not heard anything, that everything was fine, but she kept pushing. She told me to keep my phone pointed away from the door while I checked, claiming the camera was lagging and it would help the connection. That was when I knew something was very, very wrong. I told her I needed to go, that my internet was cutting out, and I ended the call abruptly. My hands were shaking as I stared at my phone screen. I opened a different messaging app, one we rarely used, and sent Emily a quick text asking if she was okay. I got a response almost immediately. She said she had been offline all evening because her internet was down, that she had not called me at all. My blood turned to ice. I read the message 3 times, trying to process what it meant. Whoever I had just been talking to, whoever had been asking me those questions and staring at me through my screen, was not my cousin. Someone had somehow accessed her account, or spoofed her contact information and had been pretending to be her. But why? What were they trying to get me to do? I sat frozen on my couch, my mind racing. Then my phone buzzed with a new message. It was from the same contact, the one I had just been on the call with, the one pretending to be Emily. The message said, "It is probably nothing, just look." I felt like I was going to be sick. I did not respond. Instead, I quietly got up from the couch and moved toward my back door, my phone clutched tightly in my hand. As I got closer, I heard it. The sound of the door handle being tested from the outside, jiggling softly like someone was trying to open it without making too much noise. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst out of my chest. I looked at the door, at the handle moving slightly, and I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The porch light outside, the one that was supposed to illuminate the small landing near my back door, was out. It had been working earlier that evening. I was sure of it. I backed away from the door as quietly as I could and grabbed the landline phone in my kitchen. I called the local RCMP detachment, my voice shaking as I explained what was happening. The dispatcher stayed on the line with me, keeping me calm, and told me officers were on their way. It felt like an eternity, but they arrived within 15 minutes. I watched from my front window as 2 officers walked around the side of my building with flashlights, checking the back entrance. When they knocked on my front door a few minutes later, I let them in, and they told me what they had found. There were fresh boot prints in the snow leading directly to my back door, and then circling around the side of the building toward the parking lot. The porch light bulb had been unscrewed, not broken, deliberately removed, so that anyone looking out through the peephole would see nothing but darkness. The officers took my statement and told me that similar reports had been coming in from other isolated homes in the area over the past few weeks. Someone had been targeting people who lived alone, using spoofed video calls and messages to gather information about their homes and routines, and then showing up in person. They said I was lucky I had not gone to check the door, that whoever was out there had likely been waiting for me to open it or get close enough to see through the window. They increased patrols in my area and told me to report any further suspicious activity immediately, but they also admitted that tracking down whoever was doing this would be difficult. The accounts used for the calls were always fake or hacked, and there were no security cameras in most residential areas. In the following weeks, I noticed something even more disturbing. Occasionally, I would get missed call notifications on my phone, appearing in my log at times when I knew for certain I had no service. The numbers always looked like slight variations of familiar contacts, a digit off here, an area code change there, just different enough that I might not notice at first glance, but still close enough to seem legitimate. I stopped answering calls unless I could verify who was on the other end through a separate platform first. I also covered my laptop camera with tape, something I had always thought was paranoid until this happened. I moved out of that apartment 2 months later, finding a place closer to the center of town where there were more neighbors and better lighting. I deleted most of my social media accounts and became extremely careful about what information I shared online. What haunts me most about this whole experience is not the fear I felt that night, or the knowledge that someone was standing outside my door trying to get in. What haunts me is how much they knew. They knew my cousin's name. They knew details about my apartment layout. They knew exactly what to say to make me trust them. That kind of knowledge does not come from luck or guessing. It comes from watching, from planning, from studying someone carefully over time. I do not know how long they had been watching me, or how much more they knew that they did not reveal. I do not know if they moved on to someone else, or if they are still out there doing the same thing to other people. All I know is that I now trust silence more than any incoming call, because at least silence cannot pretend to be someone I love. At least darkness cannot lie to me the way a familiar voice can. The cabin has always been my family's safe haven, the one place where we could escape from everything and just exist without worrying about the outside world. It sits deep in the northern Saskatchewan wilderness, about an hour and a half from the nearest town if you're driving a truck on logging roads, and even further if you're traveling by snowmobile in the winter. My grandfather built it back in the 70s, and it has been passed down through the family ever since. It is nothing fancy, just a 2-room structure with a wood stove, a small kitchen area, and enough bunk beds to sleep 6 or 7 people if everyone is willing to squeeze in. But it has always felt like home to me, maybe even more than the house I grew up in. We used it for hunting trips, fishing weekends, and sometimes just as a place to get away from civilization for a while. Up there, you do not have to worry about work, bills, or any of the usual stresses of modern life. It is just you, the forest, the lake, and the silence. One of the things I always loved about the cabin was how safe it felt. We rarely locked the doors, even when we left for the season. My dad used to say that anyone desperate enough to break into a cabin that remote probably needed whatever they were looking for more than we did. It was an unspoken rule among the families who had places out there. You did not mess with someone else's cabin, and if you were in trouble or caught in a storm, you could take shelter and leave a note explaining what you had used. It was a system built on trust and mutual respect, and as far as I knew, it had never been violated. That sense of security, that feeling that nothing bad could ever happen out there because we were too far from everything, was part of what made the cabin so special. But that all changed one winter weekend when I was 32. I had decided to go up alone to clear snow off the roof and spend a quiet night away from everything. It was mid-January, one of the coldest stretches of winter we had seen in years, with temperatures hovering around -35 even during the day. The lake was frozen solid, the ice groaning and cracking constantly as it shifted under its own weight. I had made the trip by snowmobile, hauling a small sled behind me with supplies, food, firewood, tools, and a sleeping bag rated for extreme cold. The ride out was beautiful, but brutal. The wind cut through my layers like they were not even there, and by the time I reached the cabin, my face was numb and my fingers ached despite the heavy gloves I was wearing. I got the wood stove going immediately, letting the heat slowly fill the small space, and spent the afternoon clearing the roof and checking for any damage from the heavy snowfall. Everything looked fine. The cabin was in good shape, and I felt satisfied knowing it would be ready for the family when spring came around. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped even further. The wind howled through, the trees bending them and sending snow swirling in every direction. I made myself a simple dinner, heated some water for coffee, and settled onto the old couch near the stove with a book. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the wind outside, and the occasional deep groan from the lake ice. It was the kind of peace you can only find in places like that, miles away from other people, completely disconnected from the noise of the world. I remember thinking how lucky I was to have this place, to have somewhere I could come and just be alone with my thoughts. I fell asleep on the couch sometime around 10, the fire still burning low, too tired and comfortable to bother moving to one of the bunks. I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound that did not belong. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but then I heard it again. Crunching. The unmistakable sound of someone walking slowly on crusted snow. It was faint, but deliberate. The kind of sound you only hear when someone is trying to move carefully, trying not to make too much noise, but unable to avoid it entirely. I sat up slowly, my heart already starting to pound, and listened. The crunching continued circling around the outside of the cabin. The windows were small and positioned high on the walls, so from my angle on the couch I could not see much. Just the faint glow of moonlight reflecting off the snow outside, and shadows moving across the ceiling as whatever was out there passed by the windows. I told myself it was probably an animal. A moose, maybe, or a caribou. They sometimes wandered close to cabins in the winter, looking for shelter from the wind or scraping snow off the ground to find food underneath. But the pattern of the sound was wrong. It was too rhythmic, too measured. Animals do not walk like that. Animals do not circle a building methodically, stopping at intervals as if inspecting it. I got up from the couch as quietly as I could, my legs stiff from sleep and cold, and moved toward the front window. I pressed myself against the wall and peered out through the corner of the glass, trying to see what was out there. At first, I saw nothing, just snow, trees, and the pale light of the moon. But then I saw movement, a shape staying just beyond the edge of the light, lurking near the tree line. It was too tall and too still to be an animal. My chest tightened. There was someone out there. I heard the front door handle being tested, the latch rattling softly as someone tried to open it from the outside. I had left it unlocked following the old family habit, and now I was cursing myself for it. The door creaked slightly as it was pushed open an inch, then stopped. I had wedged my boots against the base of it when I came in, more out of habit to keep the draft out than any real concern for security, and that small barrier seemed to be enough to make whoever was outside hesitate. The rattling stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. I stood there, frozen, barely breathing, waiting to see what would happen next. Then I heard footsteps moving away from the front door, crunching through the snow toward the back of the cabin. I moved quickly, grabbing the shotgun my grandfather had always kept mounted above the door. It was old but well maintained, and I knew it was loaded because I had checked it when I arrived. I did not know if I would actually use it, but holding it made me feel less helpless. I crept toward the back window, the one that looked out over the small porch where we used to clean fish in the summer. I heard the sound of something scraping against wood, and then I realized what was happening. Someone was trying to lift the window from the outside. The latch was old, just a simple hook and eye setup that could probably be forced open with enough pressure. I moved to the window and slammed my hand against the frame from the inside, startling whoever was out there. For just a split second, I saw pale fingers curled over the sill, trying to grip it, and then they disappeared. I backed away from the window, my hands shaking, the shotgun heavy in my grip. I wedged the couch against the back door and shoved one of the wooden chairs under the front door handle. It was not much, but it was something. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, sitting in the corner of the room with the shotgun across my lap, listening to every sound. I heard the footsteps return a few more times, circling the cabin, testing the doors and windows again, but they never tried to force their way in. It felt like whoever was out there was studying the cabin, learning its layout, figuring out the weak points. Around 4 in the morning, the sounds finally stopped. I heard retreating footsteps crunching away into the distance, fading into the forest, and then nothing. When the sun finally came up, I did not waste any time. I gathered my things as quickly as I could and went outside to start the snowmobile. That is when I saw them. Boot prints in the snow, everywhere. They circled the entire cabin multiple times, stopping at every window and door. Whoever had been out there had spent hours walking around the building, inspecting it from every angle. There were places where the prints stopped, and the snow was disturbed, as if someone had crouched down and looked through the gaps in the foundation, or peered through the lower windows. It made my skin crawl. I followed the tracks as far as I dared, and they led off into the tree line toward the frozen lake, eventually disappearing into an area where the wind had blown most of the snow away. I reported it to the RCMP when I got back to town, and they told me they would send someone out to check, but I knew it was pointless. By the time they got there, the tracks would be covered by new snow, and there would be no way to identify who had been there. A few weeks later, I heard rumors from other cabin owners in the area. There had been a string of break-ins at remote properties over the winter. Nothing was ever stolen, which was the strangest part. People would come back to their cabins and find signs that someone had been inside. Doors left open, furniture moved, food eaten, beds slept in. It was like someone was just passing through, using the cabins as temporary shelters, but deliberately leaving evidence behind to let people know they had been there. What disturbs me most is not that someone tried to get into the cabin. It is how patient they were. They did not try to smash a window or kick down a door. They walked around for hours, testing every entry point, studying the building, waiting for an opportunity. It felt methodical, calculated, like they were not just looking for shelter, but for something else. Like they were watching me specifically. I've been back to the cabin a few times since then, but never alone, and I always lock every door and window now. The sense of safety I used to feel out there is gone, replaced by the constant awareness that we are not as isolated as we think we are, and that the wilderness is not as empty as it seems. When you live in a small northern town in the Northwest Territories, you learn pretty quickly that the usual ways of buying and selling things do not really work. There are no big box stores, no shopping malls, and ordering things online means waiting weeks for delivery and paying insane shipping fees. So everyone up there relies on local buy and sell apps and Facebook groups to trade everything from used furniture to snowmobiles to baby clothes. It is how the community functions. You post what you have, someone messages you, you arrange a meetup, and that is it. I had been using these apps for almost 2 years without any issues. I had bought a couch from a nice older couple, sold some kitchen appliances to a young family who had just moved to town, and traded winter gear with other workers at the mine where I was employed. It always felt safe because the community was small enough that everyone kind of knew everyone, or at least knew someone who knew someone. There was an unspoken trust that came with that. I was 28 at the time, living alone in one of those temporary modular housing units that the mining company rented out to workers. The units were all identical, stacked in neat rows like shipping containers, each one with a small front step and a numbered door. It was not much, but it was affordable and close to work, so I did not complain. That spring, I decided to clear out some of my extra furniture because I was planning to move to a bigger place later in the year. I posted an ad on the local buy and sell app for a spare mattress I had been keeping in my storage closet. It was in good condition, barely used, and I priced it low because I just wanted it gone. Within a few hours, I got a message from someone interested. The profile looked normal enough, just a generic username and a blank profile picture, but that was not unusual. A lot of people up there did not bother filling out their profiles completely. The person seemed polite and asked a few basic questions about the mattress, how old it was, whether it had any stains or damage, that sort of thing. Then they asked if I could send a photo of my entrance so they would not get lost finding my unit. They explained that all the housing units looked identical and they had gotten confused trying to find someone else's place a few weeks earlier. It seemed like a reasonable request, so I stepped outside and took a quick picture of my front step and door, making sure the unit number was visible. I sent it over and thought nothing of it. They thanked me and said they would come by later that evening to pick it up. I gave them my address and told them to message me when they were close. But later that evening came and went, and I never heard from them. I sent a follow-up message asking if they were still interested, and they responded saying they were running late, that something had come up but they would definitely be there soon. They asked a few more questions, seemingly random ones. They wanted to know if I lived alone, what my work schedule was like, whether I usually kept my porch light on at night. At the time, I thought maybe they were just trying to figure out the best time to come by without disturbing me, but looking back, the questions felt invasive. I answered vaguely, saying I had a flexible schedule and that they could come by whenever it was convenient for them. They never showed up that night, and eventually I just assumed they had changed their mind and moved on. A few days later, though, I started noticing something strange. I got messages from other accounts, all with generic usernames and blank profile pictures, referencing details from the photo I had sent. One person asked if the chip paint on my doorframe had been repaired yet. Another mentioned the way my welcome mat was crooked, sitting at a slight angle on the step. These were tiny details, things you would only notice if you were really studying the photo closely, and it made me deeply uncomfortable. I started to wonder if these accounts were all the same person, or if someone had shared my photo in some group I was not aware of. I deleted the original listing and blocked all the accounts that had messaged me, but the unease did not go away. It felt like people were testing me, trying to figure out which unit was mine by referencing small details and seeing if I would confirm them. Then, one evening about a week after I had posted the ad, the power in my unit flickered briefly. It was not uncommon, especially during storms. But when I looked outside to see if other units were affected, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There was a person standing at the far end of the row of units, completely motionless, silhouetted against the glow of a streetlight. They were not walking, not looking around, just standing there, facing in the direction of the housing complex. I watched for a few minutes, telling myself it was probably just another resident out for a walk or waiting for someone, but they never moved. They just stood there, perfectly still, like a statue. Then my phone buzzed. I looked down and saw a new message notification from the buy and sell app. It was from yet another new account, and the message said, "I think I am at the right door now. Can you open up so I know?" My hands started shaking as I read the message. I looked back outside, and the figure was no longer at the end of the row. They were walking now, moving slowly down the line of units, stopping at each door and pausing for a few seconds before moving to the next one. It was methodical, deliberate, like they were checking each unit one by one. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I watched from the side of the curtain as the figure got closer and closer, stopping at each door, leaning in slightly as if listening. When they finally reached my unit, they did not knock. They just stood there for a moment, then quietly tried the door handle. It did not turn because I had locked it, but I could hear them testing it, jiggling it softly, and then they leaned against the door. The hinges creaked under the pressure, and I could see the door flex slightly inward. I did not call the police. I do not know why. Maybe I was too scared to make noise, too afraid that calling for help would let them know I was inside and alert. Instead, I grabbed my phone and texted my neighbor, a guy named Carter, who lived 2 units down. I told him there was someone at my door and I needed help. He responded almost immediately saying he was coming. A few seconds later, I heard his door open and his voice shouting, asking what the person was doing. The porch light at his unit flicked on, flooding the area with light, and I saw the figure at my door suddenly step back and walk quickly away, disappearing into the darkness between the rows of units. Carter came over and banged on my door, and I let him in. He told me he had not gotten a good look at the person, just a shape moving away, but he had seen them clearly at my door, leaning against it like they were trying to force it open. We went outside together with flashlights and checked the area. There were fresh boot prints in the snow leading from my unit back toward the parking lot, but they disappeared once they hit the plowed pavement. There were no cameras in the residential area, no way to see who had been there or where they had gone. Carter stayed with me for a while, making sure I felt safe, and then he went back to his unit. I spent the rest of the night sitting on my couch with all the lights on, staring at the door, jumping at every sound. The next morning, I checked the buy and sell app and noticed something disturbing. The buyer account that had originally messaged me, along with the review they had left on my listing saying they had picked up the mattress and giving me 5 stars, had completely vanished. The listing itself was gone, scrubbed clean like it had never existed. But then, over the next few days, I started getting new messages from fresh accounts. They were short, cryptic, unsettling. As one said, "Wrong unit last time." Another said, "One not happen again." The spelling and grammar were off, like whoever was sending them was doing it quickly or did not care about being coherent. I reported everything to the RCMP, and they took my statement seriously, but there was not much they could do. The accounts were untraceable, created with fake information and disposable email addresses. They increased patrols in the area and told me to keep my doors locked and report any further incidents, but I knew that was not enough. I deleted the app entirely, stopped posting anything online that could reveal where I lived, and started being hyper-vigilant about my surroundings. A few weeks later, I requested a transfer to a different unit on the other side of the complex, telling my landlord wanted more space, but really just needing to feel like I was not in the same place that person had found. The company approved the move without asking too many questions, and I packed up everything and left within a week. Even now, months later, I refuse to post any photos online that show even a hint of where I live. No pictures of my front door, no identifying landmarks, nothing that could be used to locate me. I have become obsessive about privacy in a way I never was before. I check every account that messages me, reverse search profile pictures, verify identities through multiple platforms before agreeing to meet anyone. My friends think I am paranoid, that I am overreacting to one bad experience, but they were not there. They did not see that figure moving down the row of units, stopping at each door, methodically searching. They did not feel the door creak under the weight of someone leaning against it, testing it, waiting. What terrifies me most is how much effort went into finding me. It was not random. It was planned, coordinated, patient, and I will never know if they found someone else or if they are still out there, sending messages, gathering photos, waiting for the next person to make the same mistake I did.